She is not leaving. That is what the woman said to me, blocking her own front door at 2 in the morning, standing there in her silk robe like she owned the night and everything in it. She looked at me like I was a traveling salesman, some nuisance to be brushed off, and not the father of the girl bleeding on her expensive hardwood floor. I am 66 years old. I have had a double knee replacement, a bad lower back from 40 years of hauling lumber, and a blood pressure problem that my doctor describes as deeply concerning, and I describe as a Tuesday. But that night, I went through that heavy oak door like I was 25 and built like a linebacker. My name is Arthur Vance, though everyone in Clallam County just calls me Art. I live in Port Angeles, Washington, in a modest cedar shingle house with a crooked mailbox I never quite got around to fixing. It is a quiet town, nestled between the dark, towering pines of the Olympic National Park and the cold gray waters of the Strait of Juan de Fuca. It is the kind of place where people keep to themselves, where the fog rolls in so thick in the mornings that you can't see your own gravel driveway, and where the rain doesn't just fall. It clings to your skin like a damp wool blanket. I raised my daughter Claire in that house. I raised her alone after my wife Martha passed away 12 years ago from a sudden heart failure that left our lives permanently fractured. This is the night that crooked mailbox stopped mattering. It was a freezing Friday in early March, the kind of cold that crawls right into your joints and stays there. The rain was coming down sideways, whipped by a biting wind off the Pacific. I remember the exact detail of how my breath fogged up the windshield of my 2012 GMC Sierra before the defroster could even gasp to life. I keep replaying that detail in my head. The pale green glow of the dashboard, the rhythmic, scraping squeak of the wiper blades, and the 15 minutes of sheer, blind terror it took me to drive from my place to the Sterlings' massive, sprawling estate in Sequim. The Sterlings lived in the kind of house that people in the county whispered about. A massive modern cedar and glass fortress overlooking the water, with a long, gated circular driveway that Eleanor Sterling loved to brag about at local charity galas. My phone had rung at exactly 2:12 a.m. I was fast asleep, dreaming of nothing at all, when the harsh vibration on my nightstand shattered the quiet dad. It was Claire's voice. But it wasn't the voice of my 32-year-old daughter, a grown woman who had her own career and her own life. It was a tiny, cracked, trembling whisper. It was the exact voice I hadn't heard since she was 7 years old, and convinced there was something monstrous hiding in her closet. "Claire," I said, sitting bolt upright, the blanket sliding off my shoulders into the cold air. "Claire, what's wrong? Where is Garrett?" There was a long, agonizing beat of static. I could hear a muffled, low rumble of voices in the background, sharp, angry, but too distant to make out. Then, a sharp gasp. "Please come get me," she whispered. The line went dead. I didn't even put on real shoes. I threw on a flannel shirt over my undershirt, shoved my feet into the old, fleece-lined leather moccasins my late wife had bought me for Father's Day a decade ago, grabbed my truck keys off the counter, and ran out the door. I did 70 miles an hour on a winding 2-lane highway that does not forgive mistakes, especially not in a freezing coastal rainstorm. The truck's headlights cut through the swirling fog, illuminating the dark, looming shapes of the Douglas firs lining the road like silent, watchful giants. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tight. My knuckles turned white, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. As I drove, the windshield wipers cleared the freezing rain in frantic sweeps, but my mind was completely frozen on that tiny, broken sound of her voice. For 5 years, I had watched my daughter build a life with Garrett Sterling. 5 years of quiet holidays, polite dinners, and a growing distance that I had desperately tried to ignore. Garrett was the golden boy of Sequim, the heir to Sterling Development Group, a man with $1 million smile, a custom-tailored wardrobe, and a pedigree that made my blue-collar background look like common dirt. I had spent 40 years running a small, independent timber harvesting crew. I spent my days in the mud, inhaling cedar sawdust, hauling heavy chainsaws through thick undergrowth, and coming home with grease under my fingernails and a persistent ache in my lower back. I was proud of that work. It paid for Claire's college, it kept a roof over our heads, and it built a life of quiet dignity. But to the Sterlings, I was just a rustic relic of a bygone era, A man who worked with his hands because he didn't have the brains to work with a pen. I had tolerated their condescension. I had swallowed their subtle snubs, their quiet jokes about my old truck, and the way they looked at my modest house as if it were a logging shack. I did it all because I believed it was what a good father was supposed to do. I wanted my daughter to be happy. I wanted her to fit into their gleaming, glass and steel world. I told myself that she was safe, that Garrett loved her, and that my blue-collar pride didn't matter in the grand scheme of things. But as the truck's tires screamed around the wet curves of Highway 101, I realized that my silence hadn't been patience. It had been permission. I had allowed them to think that because I was a quiet man, I was a weak man, and they had mistaken my quietness for blindness. When I finally pulled up to the Sterling's estate, the grand porch lights were blazing, casting a harsh yellow glare on the wet gravel of the circular driveway. Eleanor Sterling, 61 years old and a woman who looked like she meticulously ironed her silk bathrobes before bed, was already standing in the double-entry doorway. Her arms were crossed tightly over her chest, her chin tilted upward in that familiar, cold posture of supreme authority she wore like armor. She looked as if she were guarding the gates of a medieval castle, entirely unbothered by the freezing rain blowing mist onto her face. "Art," she said, her voice dropping into that polite, icy register she used whenever she wanted to remind me of the vast gulf between our bank accounts. "It is nearly 3 in the morning. Claire is resting. She is fine. You need to go home." "Then, let me see her," I said, taking a step up the stone risers. The rain was soaking through my flannel shirt, but I didn't feel the cold. I didn't feel anything but a hot, roaring silence in my ears. "She is not leaving," Eleanor replied. 3 words, delivered with the flat, unyielding finality of a judge passing sentence. And in that exact moment, something in my chest didn't just snap. It vanished. The quiet, patient man who had spent a lifetime holding his tongue, who had swallowed every subtle insult and condescending smile from this family for the sake of his daughter's marriage, was gone. "Move," I said. "Excuse me?" Eleanor's eyebrows arched, her mouth twisting into a sneer of disbelief. I said, "Move, Eleanor." She didn't move, so I did the one thing that a calmer, smarter version of me would have spent hours talking me out of. I placed my palm flat against the heavy cedar door and pushed. I pushed past a 61-year-old matriarch in her own grand foyer, brushing her aside like a dry branch in winter. I am not proud of it. I am a man who believes in respect, in boundaries, in the quiet order of things. But if you put a locked door between a father and his bleeding child, that door is coming down. I would do it again tomorrow, and I wouldn't hesitate for a fraction of a second. Charles Sterling came walking out of the kitchen, wearing a dark velvet robe, holding a crystal tumbler of scotch as if this were a pleasant weekend gathering and not the worst night of my life. He stopped when he saw me, his eyes widening in alarm. "Hey, Arthur, you can't just barge into my home." I wasn't listening to him. I was already moving through the grand arched hallway, my wet moccasins leaving dark, muddy prints on their pristine white wool carpets. I pushed open the double doors of the library, and that was where I found her. My daughter was on the floor. Not on the plush leather sofa, not resting comfortably on a chair. She was slumped against the mahogany bookcase, her body curled in a tight protective ball, as if she had slid off the leather seat, and nobody in that house had factored her into their concerns. There were marks on her arms. Dark, ugly discolorations that were already blooming purple under the soft, recessed lighting of the library. They weren't accidental scratches. They weren't the marks of a fall. They were the unmistakable shape of thick, brutal fingers digging into her skin, holding her down with terrifying force. She was pale, her breathing shallow, her eyes closed. "Claire," I whispered. My own voice didn't sound like mine. It sounded hollow, cracked, like dry wood splintering. "Claire, baby, look at me." She didn't open her eyes. She just let out a weak, shivering moan, her fingers twitching against her wet cheek. I turned around. Charles had set his scotch tumbler down on a side table. It was a smart move, because if he had been holding it, I might have taken it from him and shattered it across his teeth. Eleanor was standing in the doorway behind him, her face tight, her hands trembling slightly, but her voice remaining perfectly steady, perfectly rehearsed. "She had too much wine," Eleanor said quickly, her eyes darting to Charles. You know how emotional she gets, Art. She has these terrible panic attacks. She gets hysterical. She was falling, and Garrett was just trying to hold her up, to keep her from hurting herself on the stairs. She is unconscious on your library floor, Eleanor, I said, my voice dropping into a register so low and flat it sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a well. She is resting, Eleanor insisted, though she wouldn't look me in the eye. Where is Garrett? I asked. Nobody answered. The silence that filled that grand room was thick, suffocating, and it told me more than any confession ever could. Garrett was gone. He had fled, leaving his mother and father to sweep up the mess, to construct the lie, to keep the old man from seeing what had actually happened. I got down on my knees, knees that screamed in agony, joints that had been worn down to the bone by years of hard labor, and I gathered my daughter into my arms. Claire was 32 years old, but as I lifted her off that floor, she felt like she weighed absolutely nothing. It felt like carrying a bundle of dry leaves. She had been shrinking for months, losing weight, losing her brightness, and I had let myself believe her excuses about work stress and long hours. I had let myself believe the lie because it was easier than facing the terrifying truth. I carried her out of that house, past Eleanor, who stood frozen in the hallway, and past Charles, who couldn't even look at me. Eleanor tried to step in front of me one last time as I reached the heavy double doors, a desperate, pathetic attempt to control the narrative. If you take her, Art, you don't know what you're starting, she hissed. I stopped, holding my daughter close to my chest, and looked Eleanor Sterling dead in her cold, calculated eyes. Lady, I said, you have absolutely no idea what you just started. As I walked out into the freezing storm, carrying Claire in my arms, the cold rain lashed at my face, but I barely felt it. I laid her carefully on the bench seat of my truck, wrapping her in my old insulated canvas jacket that still smelled of motor oil and sawdust. I climbed into the driver's seat, slammed the door, and locked it. Looking back at that grand cedar and glass mansion in the rearview mirror, its lights reflecting off the wet gravel like a hollow amusement park, I felt a deep, dark stillness settle over me. For years I had believed that if I just worked hard, stayed out of trouble, and let people live their lives, the world would treat my family with the same basic decency. But some people don't understand decency. They only understand boundaries when they are drawn in steel. I got Claire into the passenger seat of my GMC truck, wrapping her in the heavy canvas jacket I kept behind the seat, and drove her straight to Olympic Medical Center in Port Angeles. I sat in that emergency room waiting room for hours, under the harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights that seemed to drain the color from everything they touched. I drank bitter, lukewarm coffee from a vending machine that tasted like punishment, replaying Eleanor's face in that doorway over and over. She is not leaving, not she is hurt, not she needs a doctor, not she is safe. She is not leaving. Like Claire was a piece of high-end furniture that belonged to the estate. Like she was property that the Sterlings had paid for and had the sole right to destroy. A doctor came out around 4:30 in the morning. He was a young man with tired, dark eyes. The kind of look that only comes from working 36 hours straight in a town that has its share of hard winters. She's stable, Mr. Vance, he said, looking down at his digital clipboard. She has a mild concussion. She's severely dehydrated, and her blood pressure is dangerously low. We've started an IV, and we ran a full toxicology screen because of the state she was in when you brought her in. What about the bruises on her arms? I asked, my voice tight, my fists clenching in my pockets. Those are deep tissue finger marks. The doctor sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. Your daughter woke up briefly while we were setting her IV. She insists she had a severe panic attack, that she mixed her anxiety medication with a glass of red wine, and that she tripped and fell down the hardwood stairs. She claims her husband was only trying to catch her, to hold her up and stop her from falling. He paused, looking at me with a quiet, professional pity that made me feel incredibly small, because she gave a clear, consistent explanation and flatly refused a forensic nursing exam. My hands are legally tied, Mr. Vance. I cannot force a police report. But I've done this for a very long time, and I highly recommend she speaks with a domestic crisis advocate. I've left some brochures on her nightstand. If she changes her mind, we can document everything. I sat with Claire for 2 days in that sterile hospital room. I held her hand, watching the steady, rhythmic green beep of the heart monitor. And I thought about every Sterling family dinner I had sat through over the last 5 years. I had sat at their grand dining table, smiling, eating overpriced Dungeness crab at that Harborview restaurant in Port Townsend they liked so much, nodding along while Garrett talked about his golf game and his firm handshake. A firm handshake. That was what I had based my judgment on when she married him. I had told myself he was a decent guy from a good family because he looked me in the eye and shook my hand like a man. I should have been watching his eyes instead. I should have been paying attention to the way my daughter quieted down whenever he entered a room. On the second night, Claire finally woke up. Really woke up. Her eyes were clear, focused, and terrified. "Dad," she whispered. "I'm here, baby," I said, squeezing her fingers. "You're safe. You're in the hospital." She grabbed my hand with a sudden desperate strength that actually hurt. "Did you go back to the house? Did they call Garrett?" "I got you out, Claire. That's all that matters right now. We don't have to go back there." She shook her head frantically, her breath catching in her throat. "No, no, Dad, listen to me. Don't go after him. Don't go to the police. Don't call a lawyer yet. Please, promise me." That stopped me cold. Of all the things I expected her to say, begging me not to fight back was the last. "Claire, after what they did to you, I know what he did. Look at your arms." "I know," she said, her voice cracking, but her eyes suddenly turning cold and sharp in a way I had never seen before. "I've known for months, Dad." "What do you mean, months?" She reached under the hospital blanket and pulled out her phone. The screen was badly cracked. The glass splintered across the display, but it still flickered to life. She swiped through a series of folders, turning the screen toward me. It was filled with bank statements, digital ledgers, tax filings, and screenshots of months of text messages. "If you go after Garrett with your fists, Dad, his family's corporate lawyers will bury you in court," Claire said, her voice dropping into a flat, steady tone that sent a chill down my spine. "They will paint you as an unstable, violent old man who assaulted Eleanor in her own home. They will say I'm an alcoholic, that I'm unstable, that I fell. We don't hit them, Dad." She looked at me, and for a second I saw her mother Martha in her eyes, that same fierce, brilliant determination that had kept our family together through our hardest years. "We outsmart them," she said. She swiped to a document labeled Confidential Financial Restructuring 2024. As I read the lines of text, my hands began to shake. I had spent 45 years working in the timberlands, dealing with honest loggers and straightforward mill managers. I had never seen anything like the cold, calculated greed that was laid out on that cracked phone screen. My late wife, Martha, had left a highly valuable estate. She came from an old Washington timber family, and before she died, she had established an irrevocable trust consisting of several hundred acres of prime Douglas fir timberland near Forks, along with several commercial properties in Port Angeles. It was Claire's birthright, a safety net designed to protect her. Long after my own hands were too stiff to hold a wrench or a saw, according to the documents, Garrett had used his position as her husband to access the trust records. 2 years ago, with the help of a corrupt accountant employed by his father's development group, he had drafted an amendment to the trust. This amendment quietly appointed him as a co-trustee, with sole administrative and borrowing powers. I had signed what I thought were standard annual tax filings for the trust, but they had slipped a specific authorization page into the middle of a 100-page stack of documents. My signature on that page had been physical forged. It was a clumsy, desperate imitation of my handwriting, written in dark blue ink. "He didn't just access the trust, Dad," Claire whispered, her eyes dark with a cold, focused fury. "He borrowed against the land. He took out 3 massive commercial lines of credit, totaling nearly $600,000, using our timberland as collateral. He funneled every single penny of that money into his own shell company, Sterling Harbor Holdings, to pay off the debts of his failing shopping center project in Sequim. And every time I asked why our annual distributions were so low, he would tell me that the timber market was in a slump, that the mills were cutting back shifts, and that we needed to be patient. Eleanor handled the digital portals, and she completely blocked my access, But that wasn't even the worst of it. Claire swiped to an email confirmation from an online life insurance company. To secure the last of his commercial loans, Garrett had been forced to list Claire as the primary guarantor and silent partner on his harbor development project. To protect his investment, he had taken out a $5 million key person life insurance policy on her. He forged my electronic signature on the application, using a dummy email address he created under my name, she said, her voice dropping so low I could barely hear it over the hum of the hospital monitor. The beneficiary isn't Garrett. It's his shell company, Sterling Harbor Holdings. If I had died in that house, if I had accidentally overdosed on my anxiety medication and fallen down those stairs, his company would have received $5 million in tax-free cash. It would have saved his entire commercial empire. I stood up and walked out of the room. I stood in the quiet, sterile hallway of the hospital, my forehead pressed against the cool plaster wall, and I fought the urge to vomit. The sheer, chilling scale of the betrayal was almost too much to comprehend. This wasn't a bad marriage. This wasn't a young couple struggling through a rough patch. This was a slow, calculated heist. They had targeted my daughter's inheritance. They had systematically bled her trust dry. And they had set up a financial structure where her death would have been the ultimate solution to their debts. I took 3 deep, cold breaths, walked back into her room, and sat down on the edge of her bed. "What do we do?" I asked. Claire looked at me, a tiny, determined smile touching the corners of her pale lips. "We make them think they won," she said. "Have you ever smiled at a man while doing the math on exactly how much it will cost to destroy his entire life?" I did it for 3 months straight. That is the one thing nobody tells you about real revenge. The real kind. Not the kind you see in movies with guns and explosions. It is slow. It is boring. It is spreadsheets at midnight, biting your tongue until your mouth tastes like iron, and smiling across a white tablecloth while a man who bruised your daughter passes you the bread basket and tells you to try the oysters. Charles Sterling's firm had spent 2 years trying to secure the capital for a massive commercial harbor development project out in Port Townsend. Garrett was the lead developer, but his father had refused to fund it fully, calling it too risky in the current economy. Garrett was desperate. He was drowning in debt, trying to maintain the illusion of a high-flying developer while his personal accounts were practically empty. And that was where we saw the opening. Claire had spent her first week out of the hospital, recovering at my house, sleeping in her old bedroom with the faded blue curtains. By the second week, she was sitting at my kitchen table, her laptop open, going through the digital files she had quietly copied from Garrett's home office computer before the incident. "They forged your signature, Dad," she told me one evening, her eyes fixed on the screen. My late wife, Martha, had set up an irrevocable timberland and real estate trust before she passed, holding several highly valuable tracts of land in the Olympic Peninsula. It was supposed to be Claire's inheritance, something to secure her future long after I was gone. 2 years ago, Garrett's father's firm had drafted an amendment to that trust, quietly appointing Garrett as a co-trustee with full management and borrowing powers. They had presented it to me as routine paperwork mixed in with our annual tax filings. I had signed a general acknowledgement page, but Garrett had forged my actual signature on the specific authorization pages, the ones that gave him the legal power to borrow against the massive equity of those timber tracts. "He borrowed against your land," Claire said, her voice flat. "He used his co-trustee status to take out 3 massive commercial lines of credit to fund his failing retail developments. Every time I asked why our trust distributions were so low, Garrett would tell me the timber market was unstable, that the local mills were struggling, and that I needed to trust his father's financial planning. Eleanor managed the primary distribution accounts, and they had completely locked me out of the digital portals. This wasn't a bad marriage. This was a sophisticated, multi-year financial heist. My daughter was the vault, and her inheritance was the prize. But the real horror, the thing that made my blood run entirely cold, was buried even deeper in the corporate filings. Garrett had listed Claire as a silent partner and primary guarantor on his new LLC for the harbor development project. Because of that specific corporate structure, He had been able to take out a $5 million key person life insurance policy on her through an online carrier, using a forged electronic signature and a dummy email address he controlled. The beneficiary of that $5 million policy wasn't Garrett's name directly. It was his shell company, Sterling Harbor Holdings, meaning the payout would completely bypass standard marital scrutiny if anything ever happened to her. I had to stand up and walk out onto my back porch when she showed me that. I stood there in the freezing night air, my hands gripping the railing so hard the wood groaned, and I just breathed. If Claire had died in that Sequim house in March from an accidental overdose of anxiety medication and red wine, Garrett's failing harbor project would have been instantly injected with $5 million of tax-free cash. He would have been a grieving widower, a local tragedy, and a very, very wealthy man. I didn't finish that thought. I never let myself finish that thought. Instead, I walked back into the kitchen, sat down opposite my daughter, and said, "So, how do we let them in?" 2 weeks later, I called Charles Sterling myself. I picked up the phone, dialed the number I had sworn I would never touch again, and said the words that nearly choked me on the way out. "Charles, it's Art. Listen, I've had some time to think. Families fight. I don't want to lose my daughter over a misunderstanding, and I don't want this tension hanging over us. Can we meet?" There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. I could almost hear the gears turning in Charles's head, the relief washing over him as he realized the old lumberman wasn't going to bring a lawsuit or a shotgun to his door. "Art, glad you called," Charles said, his voice instantly sliding into that warm, booming executive tone. "I think that is the mature thing to do. Let's put the past behind us." Sure, he called me mature. I wanted to reach through the copper wires and tear his throat out, but I smiled. I kept my voice slow, easy, and tired. We met at an upscale seafood grill overlooking the marina in Port Townsend. Charles ordered the lobster. I ordered the Dungeness crab. I matched his order, a cheap psychological trick I had learned decades ago in business. But it works. It makes a man feel like you are on the same team, that you share the same tastes, the same rhythm. "Garrett's Harbor project," I said, cutting into my food, keeping my tone perfectly casual. "The commercial development out past the marina. I've been hearing some good things about it from some of my old contacts in the timber trade." Charles's eyebrows went up. He paused, his fork hovering. "You've been asking around?" "I'm retired, Charles," I said, leaning back and taking a slow sip of my water. "I've got a lot of capital sitting in municipal bonds and timber accounts doing nothing but collecting dust. I want my daughter to be happy. I want my future grandchildren to grow up with a family that isn't fractured by silly arguments. If Garrett needs a serious investor to get the project off the ground, I might be willing to put some real weight behind it." I watched him take the bait. It was like watching a trout rise from the dark depths of a cold lake to take a shiny hook, not even realizing the steel was already there. "What kind of number are we talking?" Charles asked, trying to sound casual and failing completely. "Enough to make it real," I said. "But Charles, I'll be honest with you. If I'm putting my retirement nest egg into this, I need to see everything. The books, the LLC structures, the trust ledgers, the contract histories, all of it. I didn't build my business by investing blind." He smiled. A big, easy, arrogant smile. The smile of a man who truly believes he is the smartest person in any room he walks into. "Art, that's just smart business," he said, reaching across the table to shake my hand. I respect that. He wouldn't respect it in 3 months. But I let him smile anyway. Getting full access to their corporate files took 6 weeks. There were lawyers, non-disclosure agreements, and a welcome back to the family dinner where Eleanor Sterling actually hugged me. Hugged me. The same woman who had blocked her own front door with her arms crossed, who had told me my daughter was just resting while she lay bruised on the floor. She called me a savior. She called me part of the team. "Lady," I thought as I smiled back at her, "I am the opposing team. You just haven't looked at the scoreboard yet." Claire and I worked late at night, long after the rest of the county had gone to sleep. We would sit at my kitchen table, the laptop screen casting a pale, cold glow over the hundreds of printed pages Charles's accountant had handed over. They had handed them over far too easily, because rich men who have never been challenged eventually stop checking the locks on their own doors. They assume their status makes them untouchable. We found the forged trust amendment first, buried in a folder of miscellaneous asset listings from 2024. The signature on the authorization page was a clumsy, desperate attempt at my handwriting. It wasn't even close. "That is not your signature, Dad," Claire said, her voice completely flat as she stared at the black ink. I had seen my own signature on thousands of lumber contracts, house deeds, and tax forms. She was right. It was a joke. We also uncovered the trail of Garrett's desperate financial maneuvers. To keep the Sequim retail center afloat, he had quietly borrowed against 3 separate tracts of timber near Forks that belonged to Claire's trust. He had used a local notary, a man named Henderson who had done business with the Sterlings for 20 years, and who didn't ask too many questions when Garrett brought in documents already signed by Arthur Vance. We documented the dates of those notary filings, cross-referencing them with my own medical records that proved I was in Seattle, undergoing knee therapy on the exact days I had supposedly signed those documents in Sequim. Then came the life insurance policy trail. Garrett had used an online insurance portal to submit the application, but he had made one critical mistake. He had registered the account using a dummy email address, but he had accessed that email account from the Sterling Development Group's corporate Wi-Fi network. Our forensic computer expert, a sharp young guy we hired out of Seattle, was able to secure the IP log that traced the digital signature directly to Garrett's work computer. Every night, Claire would print out the new findings and slip them into a thick black leather binder. Her hands were steadier than mine. I would look at the forged papers and feel a hot, silent rage bubbling in my stomach, but she would just touch my arm and whisper, "Patience, Dad. Let them dig the hole a little deeper." By week 10, we had it all. Falsified signatures, unauthorized loans, tax filings that didn't add up across 3 fiscal years, and a hidden life insurance policy with a timing that would make any homicide detective raise an eyebrow. "There is a final deal closing meeting in 2 weeks," Claire told me, her voice calm and quiet as we sat over our cold coffee. "Garrett is finalizing the capital transfer with his father's corporate attorney. They think my signature is the last piece. They think they've already won." "They think wrong," I said. "Then that's the day," she replied. 2 weeks. 14 days. 14 days of sitting on a mountain of explosive evidence, acting like nothing was wrong. 14 days of receiving family group texts about Sunday brunch. 14 days of Eleanor sending me holiday recipes. 14 days of Charles calling me partner on the phone. Patience. My wife Martha used to tell me that patience was my weakest muscle. I spent those 2 weeks building that muscle, like a man training for a heavyweight title fight. The night before the meeting, Claire and I sat at the kitchen table one last time. The coffee had gone cold, and the house was dead quiet except for the wind rustling through the pines outside. "Are you sure about this, Claire?" I asked, looking at her tired face. She didn't look up right away. When she did, her eyes were wet, but her jaw was set in that firm, unyielding line. "I called you at 2 in the morning because I thought I was going to die in that library, Dad," she said, her voice remarkably steady. "I am not scared of a corporate conference room. That's my girl," I said. "That's exactly my girl." The meeting was set for 10 o'clock on a cold, foggy Tuesday morning at Charles Sterling's corporate headquarters in Sequim. It was a modern office building on the water, with massive glass windows offering a panoramic view of the marina and the gray, misty Olympic mountains in the distance. Charles had set up the grand conference room. A polished mahogany table, leather chairs, and bottled water lined up like plastic soldiers. The whole show was designed to make people feel small, to remind them who held the power. Charles walked in first, his designer suit pressed, his executive smile loaded. Eleanor was right behind him, wearing a white cashmere wrap and her signature pearls, looking as if she were attending a high society luncheon. Garrett came in last, his hands in his pockets, looking a little thin, a little tired, but still carrying that smug, arrogant confidence his father had taught him. "Art, Claire." Charles spread his arms wide, beaming as if we were his favorite people in the world. "Glad we could finally get this settled. Big day for the family business." "Big day, Charles," I agreed, sitting down at the table. "You have no idea. Their corporate attorney, A slick young man with a gold Rolex and a suit that cost more than my first truck slid the final transfer documents across the polished mahogany toward Claire. "We just need your signature here, Claire, and your father's signature on page 12 to authorize the timberland equity release," the attorney said, tapping the pages with a gold pen. "This finalizes the capital transfer to Sterling Harbor Holdings. It's a formality, really." "Claire didn't pick up the pen. "Before I sign anything," she said, her voice cool and steady, "I want to ask a question." Charles's smile flickered. Just for a fraction of a second, his eyes narrowed. "Of course, sweetheart. Ask away." "Whose handwriting is this?" Claire asked. She reached into her folder, pulled out a printed copy of the 2024 Timber Trust Amendment, and slid it across the table. Silence. A beautiful, heavy, suffocating silence filled the room. The kind of silence that wealthy, powerful people are not used to sitting in. "That is your signature, Claire," Eleanor said quickly, her voice rising slightly in pitch, her fingers clenching her pearls. "You signed that 2 years ago. We have the notary page." "I didn't sign it, Eleanor," Claire said, her voice dropping into a register that made the slick attorney look up from his papers. "I have never seen this document in my life until my father secured the ledgers. And my father certainly didn't authorize a $400,000 line of credit to bail out Garrett's retail debts." Charles's face began to lose its color. "Art, what is the meaning of this?" he said, turning his cold eyes onto me. "If this is some kind of negotiation tactic." "It's not a negotiation, Charles," I said, leaning forward, resting my calloused hands on their polished table. "I think your attorney needs to check the hallway." Before Charles could speak, the heavy glass doors of the conference room opened. 2 special agents from the Washington State Patrol's Financial Crimes Division walked in, accompanied by a representative from the county prosecutor's office. We had spent the last 3 weeks coordinating with them, providing them with the pristine digital and physical paper trail Claire had gathered. By allowing Charles and Garrett to present these specific transfer documents, which relied entirely on the forged 2024 Trust Amendment. At a formal corporate closing, we had let them walk right into a trap. They had just committed grand larceny, uttering a forged document, and corporate fraud right in front of state investigators. "What is going on here?" The Slick's attorney stood up, his gold Rolex flashing under the fluorescent lights. "This is a private corporate meeting." "Not anymore, Counselor," the lead agent said, presenting a formal search and seizure warrant to Charles. "We have an active criminal warrant for grand larceny, identity theft, and institutional embezzlement regarding the Vance Timber Trust. Because your firm facilitated the filing of these forged instruments, we are here to secure all physical and digital records relating to Sterling Development Group. Nobody leaves this room until our team secures the server data." Garrett's face went entirely white like the fog rolling off the harbor. He looked like a man watching his own execution being scheduled. I almost laughed, I really did. 66 years old, and I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from smiling right there in their grand boardroom. Charles turned to me, his face the color of wet paper, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and terror. "Art, you did this." "No, Charles," I said, leaning back and looking him dead in the eye. "You did this 2 years ago when you let your son steal my wife's legacy." I just turned the lights on. Eleanor stood up so fast her leather chair scraped violently against the floor. "You used us," she shrieked, her voice cracking. "You smiled at our table. You drank our wine. You ate our food." "Lady," I said, my voice dropping into that quiet, freezing tone that had finally found its home. "I felt guilty for exactly 4 seconds back in March, when I had to push past you in that doorway while my daughter lay bleeding on your floor. That guilt is long gone. You blocked a door and told me she wasn't leaving. You don't get to talk to me about what people deserve." Eleanor had nothing. For the first time since I had met her, the grand Eleanor Sterling had absolutely nothing to say. Garrett tried one last move. Of course he did. Men like Garrett always think their charm is a get-out-of-jail-free card. He turned to Claire, his voice dropping into that soft, pleading tone he had probably used the very first time he lied to her. "Claire, baby, you know I love you. Whatever they think they found, we can talk about this. Just us, baby. Please." He called her baby. After the bruises, after the forged signatures, after the $5 million life insurance policy. I had to physically grip the arms of my chair to keep from leaping across the table and ending his life right there. But I didn't have to. Claire did it for me. She reached into her folder, pulled out a document, and slid it across the mahogany table. It was a formal divorce petition, already signed, dated for that morning. I called my dad at 2 in the morning because I thought I was going to die in your parents' house. Garrett, her voice didn't waver a single fraction of a millimeter. There is no version of just us anymore. There never will be again. She stood up, looking taller, stronger, and more beautiful than she ever had in her entire life. Oh, and the $5 million key person policy you took out on me? She added, looking down at him. It's already been flagged by the state insurance commissioner's fraud unit. I hope that Harbor deal was worth it. The fallout didn't stop in the boardroom. It radiated outward, tearing through the community and, eventually, through our own family. By the following Sunday, the news had hit the local Port Angeles papers. The headline on the front page of the Peninsula Daily News was stark. Prominent Sequim developer under state investigation for financial fraud and forgery. Right there beneath the text were the booking photos of Garrett and his father, Charles. But within hours, my phone began to buzz. It started with my sister, Evelyn, then my cousin, Arthur, then aunts, uncles, and distant relatives I hadn't spoken to since Martha's funeral 12 years ago. They were all calling, their voices dripping with that self-righteous, wounded indignation that family members save for drama they don't actually understand. It was my cousin Clarissa, who really tried to go for the jugular. She called me at 8 o'clock on Sunday morning, her voice sharp and trembling with anger. "Arthur, I heard what you did to the Sterlings," she snapped. "Garrett is absolutely devastated. He is facing prison time, Arthur. And Charles's firm is in ruins. How could you do this to your own daughter's family? You've disgraced our name. Martha would be rolling in her grave if she could see you turning on your own blood's marriage like this. She used my dead wife's name like a knife, knowing exactly where the old scar was, hoping to make me bleed, hoping to force me back into the quiet, compliant box I had lived in for years. I let her finish. I sat on the edge of my bed, holding the phone, letting her say every single ugly, misinformed word. Then I spoke calmly. "Clarissa, I am going to send you a message. Read it and then call me back if you still feel like talking." I hung up. I created a group text message. I added every single relative who had called, texted, or whispered about us over the last 48 hours. Every aunt, uncle, cousin, and family friend who had taken Garrett's side. I didn't argue. I didn't plead my case. I didn't write a single word of explanation or defense. I just sent 4 files. The first was the photograph I had taken of my daughter's arms in the emergency room. Pale, bruised skin with the deep, purple finger marks of a man who had held her down until she went cold. The second was the Olympic Medical Center emergency discharge report, detailing the mild concussion and dehydration she had suffered while locked in that house. The third was a copy of the official forgery report from the State Patrol, showing the side-by-side comparison of my real signature and the clumsy forgery Garrett had penned to steal $600,000 from her trust. The fourth was the copy of the $5 million key person life insurance policy, highlighting the shell company beneficiary and the forged electronic signature. And beneath those 4 files, I typed one single solitary sentence. Garrett held my daughter down until she was bruised, stole $600,000 from the legacy her mother left her, and took out a $5 million policy on her life that would have saved his company if she had died in that house. If any of you believe this is a family misunderstanding, you are more than welcome to open your own homes and let him move in with you. Do not contact me or my daughter again." I put my phone on silent, walked out to my workshop, and spent the rest of the cold morning carving a cedar block. Clarissa called back 6 hours later. I didn't answer. She left a voicemail, her voice small, shaking, and completely stripped of the righteous fury she had carried that morning. "Arthur, my God, I am so sorry. I had no idea they did that to her." I deleted the voicemail. I didn't save it. By that evening, the family group chat had gone completely silent. Not one aunt, not one uncle, not one cousin replied. Not a single person defended Garrett. Not one person suggested we were being unreasonable. Turns out, the sight of a daughter's bruises and a forged signature says more than any lie a weak family can spin to save their own reputation. The weeks that followed were quiet, almost boring in the best possible way. The Sequim Development Company collapsed entirely under the weight of the state and federal indictments. The bank foreclosed on the grand cedar and glass mansion in Sequim, and Eleanor's prized circular driveway was eventually blocked by a massive rusty bank repossession sign. And here is the part that almost made me laugh out loud when my neighbor, Martha, told me about it. Garrett, Eleanor, and Charles had to scramble to find somewhere to live. With their corporate assets frozen and their personal credit ruined by the fraud investigation, they couldn't afford any of the high-end rentals along the coast. So, they ended up renting a cramped, double-wide mobile home out by the highway in Port Angeles, right next to a noisy gravel pit. 3 adults. One small bathroom, a tiny kitchen that smelled of diesel exhaust and wet gravel, and absolutely no money left for country club memberships, luxury cruises, or tailored silk robes. Eleanor got exactly what she had always bragged about, living closely with her family under one roof, just not the grand roof she had planned to pay for with my daughter's life. I was driving back from the local lumber yard about 3 weeks ago, my truck bed loaded with fresh cedar planks for a new cabinet project. As I passed the highway mobile park, I saw him. It was Garrett. He was standing near a rusty dumpster, wearing a faded gray sweatshirt with holes in the sleeves, hauling a heavy black garbage bag. His shoulders were slumped, his face looked thin, and he looked far older than 36. On the small wooden steps of the double-wide, Eleanor and Charles were sitting in 2 cheap plastic lawn chairs, looking out at the highway traffic as if they were waiting for a bus that was never going to arrive. I didn't slow down. I didn't honk my horn. I just pressed my foot on the gas and kept driving, the hum of my GMC's engine drowning out the rattle of the gravel pit. That was the last time I saw any of them. I thought I would feel sad. I thought I would feel some lingering guilt, some fatherly instinct to feel bad for the family my daughter had spent 5 years trying to build. But as I drove along the coastal highway, the gray waters of the Strait of Juan de Fuca stretching out vast and free to my right, all I felt was the smooth, quiet hum of my truck and the deep, reassuring knowledge that I had done exactly what a father was supposed to do. I had stopped catching them, and they had finally hit the ground. Some debts can never be repaid. Some doors, once you close them and turn the lock, do not open a second time. 6 weeks after the divorce was finalized, Claire and I sat on my back porch on a warm, clear May evening. I had a cold beer in my hand, and she was holding a hot mug of chamomile tea, and we were listening to nothing but the wind rustling through the dark pine needles and the distant, rhythmic crash of the waves against the harbor walls. The house felt like ours again. The quiet felt like ours again. My phone buzzed on the cedar table beside me. It was a text from Garrett. "Claire, Dad, we are drowning," the message read. "The rent on the trailer is due on Friday, and we are completely short. The court fees and the lawyers ate everything we had left. Eleanor is sick, and there is literally no space here for anyone to breathe. Please, you have those empty bedrooms in the Port Angeles house. Just let us come stay for a few weeks. We are so sorry. Please, Art." I read the message twice. Then I looked out at the front yard, at the crooked mailbox resting in the quiet dark, and then at my daughter who was looking up at the stars, her face calm, beautiful, and completely free of the terror she had carried for 5 years. I thought about the word Eleanor had used when she blocked that door in March. Selfish. She had told me I was being selfish for wanting my daughter back. I tapped the screen and typed back slowly, my hand perfectly steady. "You were right, Garrett. I am being selfish. And I have never understood the value of that word more clearly in my life. Good luck." I hit send, then I blocked his number. I sat there on the porch for another 20 minutes, finishing my beer, watching the stars blink open through the dark branches of the pine trees. There were no heavy footsteps in my house that didn't belong. There was no whispering in the dark hallways. There was no one telling my daughter she was too emotional. No one trying to measure her life in dollars and cents. Just the quiet. Our quiet. And for the first time in 5 long years, that word didn't feel like something we had to apologize for. It felt like something we had earned. If you enjoyed this story, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below letting me know where you are watching from. Your support helps us keep sharing these raw, real stories of justice. I will see you on the next one.